President. I thank all the members for the contributions they've made. They've covered many key areas. I'd also echo the thanks and acknowledgement that have been given to the Premier and to the Cabinet team and to Darren Hine, the State Controller now, as well as OPC and particularly Meg Webb for the work she's done bringing this together so quickly and so effectively. I support this legislation, and it's legislation that's incredibly important because difficult and rapid decisions are being made, and the power to make and implement those decisions is required to be supported through a complex array of legislative changes and arrangements. In this state of emergency, Mr President, we've got our immediate health needs, which are of course the priority, and the practical impacts to the functioning of our community that flow on from the decisions being made around those health needs are being felt by all. One of the things I'm very mindful of is that there is hardship that entails from these decisions and the important measures that need to be taken to protect health in our community. The hardships that do flow from these aren't felt equally. It's as simple as that. Some people will be bearing immense and life-changing impacts from the hardships that are flowing through here. Some will be left quite bereft and on quite a different trajectory than they were on before all this came to pass. Others will, of course, feel hardship and feel that they've been impacted, but perhaps be more of the nature that they're being left less well off or inconvenienced or having to take a few steps back from where they might have been. And, of course, that's difficult and it feels difficult. I'm quite focused on that first category, who are most vulnerable to the impacts that are flowing through. Members here have spoken about many key features in the bill, and I thank them for it. I'm not going to spend time repeating things that people have covered well. I note that many who are more experienced than I am here have spoken about the power in this legislation, that the powers conferred here and the accountabilities that are important to be in place around that. And as a new member of the Subordinate Legislation Committee, I'm sure I'm going to learn a great deal as we undertake quite an important role in that committee in coming months. While we do need to be acting very quickly to protect our community and our state, as a parliament we still have that function to fulfil as elected representatives around accountability. And I certainly stand ready with the other members of that committee to do that. Others who are very experienced in this place have spoken about the gravity of the powers and that we need to ensure that we're mindful of our responsibilities. And while this is coming through rapidly, we're all trying our best to give it the focus and attention it requires and to act as best we can to make sure that this is the best piece of legislation possible given its rapid transition through the chambers. And thank you to others who are accommodating that, and thank you to the government who are also accommodating our efforts, which of course, yes, are being done on the hop. So the part of the bill that I would like to speak about just in a little bit more detail that I'm particularly interested in focusing on are those parts that relate to residential tenancies. Members won't be surprised that that's an area I might be interested in given my background and given the focus I have on ensuring that we best support vulnerable Tasmanians. As I said earlier, that those people who will be feeling the significant detrimental impacts of our current situation are those who began as most vulnerable, those who were on the lowest incomes, those that are also losing their jobs but perhaps started off from a very low base to begin with. They may have had no savings, they may have no supportive network of family and friends around them, and in many other ways may be finding themselves particularly at risk in this current situation. As far as I'm concerned, when we balance the needs amongst our community, we must give compassionate priority to those people who are in those categories and are most vulnerable. I've mentioned in speaking yesterday in this place that for a long time we have had two Tasmanias, people who have struggled to be forging ahead while others in this state have been able to best make the most of opportunities that recent years have provided. And I'm particularly mindful that we must be one Tasmania right now. This is the time, our moment, when in order to get through this, we must be a single community moving forward. We all have to come together. And I'm very interested and keen that as we come together in this moment of urgency and emergency, that we also emerge from the other side of that crisis and rebuild our future as one Tasmania still. We've got the opportunity to make sure that people are best supported going forward from this so that we don't re-emerge with a greater division in place than we had coming into this time. So, to the detail on the rental tenancies, I'm very pleased to see that there is a real focus here to try to best protect people. The hardship provisions that are encompassed in this legislation are very positive to see. Arrangements to ensure that things such as inspections into the homes and those sort of things don't take place during emergency times to best protect health are excellent, along with the acknowledgement that some of the usual requirements of a lease agreement, a tenancy, may not need to be enforced across this time. So people being able to say, upkeep the garden or keep the house in the same state that they might otherwise be expected to keep it. That's very, very good to see. I'm pleased to see that there remains a requirement that urgent and emergency repairs are still made so that minimum standards can be maintained in residential tenancies. And I appreciate the discussion that has been had in the other place and also in our briefings already here today around how best to protect people from eviction, and that the measures in the bill are efforts towards that. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that and just put some questions into the record so that we can cover them from the government in reply and then perhaps as we go through the committee stage. I'm particularly interested in the protections around eviction because I believe that we must keep people housed, and we must keep people housed in the immediate time of crisis and emergency as a health measure, not just for those people but for all of us. But I also know that we must keep people housed as we emerge from the emergency situation, and again to maintain our health as a broader community, but also to best move forward from the hardship and build towards the future. So evictions is something that's quite sensitive in that, because people at risk of homelessness then become at risk of all sorts of other things. The way it's dealt with in the legislation is in two parts. It's dealt with, and an amendment from the other place has been made to Section 22(2), and that now says has been amended so that it now says the Minister may by notice declare that despite any provision of a lease that is within a class of leases specified in the notice must not, within the emergency period, be terminated, and the rent payable under the lease may not be increased in the circumstances set out in the notice. Now, I'm pleased to see that the Residential Tenancy Act has been removed from the under that amendment. It does rely on the Minister making a notice that does include the Residential Tenancy Act within that. We want people to be covered so that they can't have their lease terminated and that the rent payable under the lease may not be increased. There are other sorts of tenancies that actually aren't covered by the Rental Tenancy Act but may come within that class of leases mentioned in that part. Subtenancies, uni accommodation, thank you, caravan parks, things like that, which I also hope would be, if such a notice was made by the Minister, would be specified as being within the class of leases in that notice. I guess the concern is I would like to have some comfort from the government, some reassurance that a notice made under this section here would actually include the Residential Tenancy Act to be covered as a class of lease, so that during the emergency period leases would not be terminated and the rent payable would not be increased. Some reassurance about that we could look to that would be appreciated. The other part that deals with evictions is in Schedule 2, the consequential amendments section under number 7, part 7. Now, this provides protection for eviction for non-payment of rent. So it means that during this period of emergency, people who are unable to pay their rent can't be given a notice to vacate, or that notice can't be given effect during the emergency period. It also states that even if a notice to vacate has already been given prior to this emergency time but hasn't yet been given effect, it won't be given effect during this emergency time. Now that's good, but I think it could be better. I think better protection could be provided to protect against potentially other causes of eviction that are covered in the Residential Tenancy Act beyond just non-payment of rent. Excuse me. We've heard in our briefings from the Residential Tenancy Commissioner that the most frequent reason for a notice to vacate being given is in fact non-payment of rent. So this covers that most frequent reason. However, what I'm concerned about is that with that option removed, and I'm just thinking of worst case scenarios, and others are concerned about this, I know, such as the Tenants Union, others out there who work with vulnerable tenants. I'm concerned that with the option removed to evict a tenant on the basis of non-payment of rent, landlords may then seek to use other reasons listed in the Residential Tenancy Act to effect a notice to vacate. I've prepared an amendment and informed by the Tenants Union and working, thank you to OPC, to assist to draft an amendment which I believe could be made quite readily to this Part 7 in Schedule 2 that would actually extend that protection beyond just non-payment of rent to some of the other reasons covered by the Rental Tenancy Act, which I think would give us confidence that there can be no sort of going around the particular protection provided here and give a more comprehensive protection to people. I'd appreciate hearing from the government on if they couldn't support such an amendment, what other confidence they could provide for us that a more comprehensive protection is there and can be provided, given what's simply in there about non-payment of rent. As I said, I believe it's of absolute primary importance that vulnerable people remain housed at this time. It's not just the immediate health needs, it's the future wellbeing, it's our future economic success even. It's in all our interests to ensure that people remain housed now and remain housed as we emerge from the crisis time. So I make no apologies for prioritising those sorts of protections. I would rather that we erred well and truly on the overdoing it side to protect vulnerable people rather than underdoing it. It's harder for people who are in those vulnerable situations to be their own advocates, to seek out protection that isn't there immediately available to them. If they have to go through processes where they need to go and get advice and then take numerous steps in order to protect their interests, that's a barrier and a challenge. And in these times, any barrier, any administrative barrier like that, any barrier to that person being able to readily be protected is problematic. I'm also quite concerned that should people be unable to pay their rent across this emergency time, even as the legislation is drafted now, they would be protected in the immediate sense from being evicted. But then at the close of the emergency period, they would then become at risk. It's the way that I read this, that they would become at risk of homelessness, because a notice to vacate could then be given effect on the basis of the non-payment of rent during the emergency period. And that would see them both potentially evicted and also liable for the unpaid rent. This is going to be a period of time that those households or those individuals may well still be in quite extreme financial hardship. So I would like to hear from the government a little bit more about how those sorts of circumstances are anticipated to be dealt with, and how people who may be in that situation where we've protected them during the emergency period for not being able to pay their rent, but then will face quite a significant impact as soon as the emergency period ends. Another thing that I'm just going to note is that across this time, I think the government, and I would like to hear from the government on how we might best ensure that the way information is provided about these arrangements and protections is effective in reaching the people who need to have that information. As I just said before, administrative barriers or people having to go and seek out information about their best protections or how they can assert their rights, any of those sorts of things, are problematic for people actually achieving their rights or being able to maintain their situation. I would like to suggest that a real focus and a highlight needs to be on how information about this is provided so that we know people have that information available to them. I think that the resources that are provided to, say, the Tenants Union, community legal centres, legal aid, are all a matter to be discussed in coming times when we think about the flow-on impacts of all these matters, because people will need to seek support. They will need to have assistance to best advocate for themselves, and we will need to resource the groups that do that. I think that's really wraps up what I wanted to say in particular about the tenancy aspects of this, and I'll look forward to the government providing information about that back to us. And then I'm interested in putting my amendment if I believe that the information we have back doesn't, in my view, provide the level of comprehensive protection I think it needs to, and we can discuss that during the committee stage.